Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending where we are or when you are listening to this. Indeed, I'm Alex Milovanoff. I'm finishing my PhD at the University of Toronto. And today I'm going to present a work that I've done during a research exchange at the National University of Singapore in collaboration with the National University of Singapore and with the Singapore University of Technology and Design. The name of the work is Strategies to Mitigate Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Urban Passenger Land Transport. So a very short note that this title is a little bit different from the one that has been advertised in the website. The work has changed a little bit of scope, but it's not that different. Okay, so urban passenger land transports, such as buses, rapid transit systems, motorcycles, private cars, account for a large share of urban GHG emissions. Globally, it's about 8 to 10%, but obviously it can be higher or lower depending on the cities and the contexts. But most of these estimates are actually from vehicle exhaust. And it's difficult to estimate the actual GHG emissions of urban passenger land transport, including the other economic sectors that interact with it. For example, the manufacturing phases of the vehicles, or the fuel production phases. That could be from electricity for electric vehicles or alternative vehicles, or also the refinement, the refinery distribution of other types of fuels. So you're probably well aware about the life cycle assessment method. That is a tool to account for those types of emissions. But this is one of the first questions we asked when we started this work, was to quantify the life cycle GHG emissions of urban passenger land transport. Once you have quantified it, the next stage is to try to mitigate it. As you're probably aware, we have a collective agreement to limit the global warming by the end of the century at 2 degrees and ideally at 1.5 degrees. And most scientists agree that the changes in global temperature are associated with cumulative emissions. And so the cumulative emissions from now up to 2000 is really important. It will have a direct impact on the actual climate change target, on the global warming and temperature change targets. So one of the other questions we've asked in this work is, how can we refine this budget at a more refined level, at a sectoral or urban level, to try to build technological and political goals? In urban passenger land transport, the mitigation strategies could be divided in 3 main categories that are the avoid, shift, and improve framework. The idea of the avoid strategies is to reduce the trip length, and the trip frequencies by, for example, changing urban settlement patterns to reduce the distance between home and work, or even promoting active mobility to reduce the motorized travel activity and so reduce the trip frequencies. The shift strategies aim to shift from the highest emitting mode of transport to the lowest emitting mode of transport. So usually it's from private cars to buses, rapid transit systems. And finally, the improve components refers to the solutions that aims to improve the technologies for the existing transport modes. So for example, deploying electric vehicles that because they have higher engine efficiency, or even improving fuel economy, changing the design of vehicles, etc. But those solutions have a certain dynamics, because for one day to another, you cannot shift the entire system to either lower emitting modes or with different types of technologies and engines. And they also have GHG emission implications. You're probably all aware that electric vehicles requires more battery, more electricity, etc. And so the last key question we've asked is, how can we assess these life cycle GHG emission implications of the different mitigation strategies, their dynamics, and how can we compare them with suitable budgets? So I'm going to summarize the 3 research objectives that we had in this project. We basically wanted to assess the current and prospective life cycle GHG emissions of urban passenger land transport. We wanted to determine suitable GHG emission budgets for urban passenger land transport to stay below 1.5 and 2 degrees global warming targets. And we wanted to outline GHG emission pathways to remain within these budgets, including the physical interactions of the different components of the system. So to answer those questions, we use Singapore as a case study. So for those of you who are not aware or don't know Singapore much, Singapore is a country in Southeast Asia. So it's a city-state, but it's an island with 5.6 million people. Its national emissions are quite low compared to global emissions, 0.13%, but its emission per capita are at 8.5 ton of CO2 per capita, which is almost twice the global average. So Singapore has strong commitments towards sustainability and has quite a lot of work to do. And it's a great case study for urban passenger land transport. It has already efficient systems, but it has strong and stronger commitments to come. So the framework we've developed, we called it the Climate Change Constrained Urban Passenger Transport Integrated Lifecycle Assessment, or CURTAIL. And the objective of this framework is to answer the three key objectives that I presented before. So assessing the emissions perspectives, developing budgets, and outlining emission mitigation pathways. So the CURTAIL comprises several modules I'm going to present in this slide, and then I'm going to dive into the two key contributions in the next slides. My intention here is not to provide you a deep understanding of all the factors and parameters that are going into the module. What I've tried to do here is to outline the higher level components of the module. And if you are interested, we can discuss, and hopefully a paper by the end of the year probably be published where you could see all the details. But the first component is called the passenger transport module. And so the idea of this module is to quantify the passenger and vehicle activity by transport mode. So in our case study, for example, we included the 8 representative transport modes in Singapore: rapid transit systems, buses, motorcycles, taxis, private cars, and all the types of specific modes. And we quantify a total motorized transport activity. So the passenger kilometer traveled by all motorized transport. We quantify the modal share for the different modes. And we quantify the load factors and the distance traveled by the vehicle to quantify the vehicle activity by transport mode. So the vehicle kilometer traveled per year. We've done that historically and prospective scenarios. Then from these values, we've been able to quantify what we call a fleet module, where we have been able to create vintage fleet stocks that simulates the interactions of the vehicles between each other. So you probably know that every year new vehicles are getting into the fleet based on economic development and the needs for further travel or not, but also based on the old vehicles that are being scrapped. And so we've tried to simulate this based on survival rates. And also we've done this per technology. So it means that each mode was divided into multiple technologies representing conventional and alternative technologies such as electric vehicles. And we use vehicle technology market share to simulate the fleet dynamics from now up to 2050. And finally, using vehicle characteristics such as fuel consumption utility factor for hybrid vehicles and the weight of the vehicles, we've been able to quantify the resulting fuel use per year and per type of fuel. Finally, we've calculated the life cycle GHG emissions using life cycle emission factors based on the results of the previous modules. So in our case study, we only quantify the manufacturing phases of the vehicles, the fuel production and the fuel use phase. An obvious improvement will be to include infrastructure installation, for example, or even further types of stages. Another module, and that's one of the key contributions that I'm going to present in the next slide, is the GHG emission budget module, where we quantify and determine a suitable budget to stay within 1.5 or 2 degrees. And I'm going to describe that later. Then finally, once we have all those modules, we've built a mitigation module where we're trying to optimize some key mitigation variables to try to make the GHG emissions of urban passenger transport equalize the GHG emission budget. So the GHG emission budget module is one of the key contributions of our work because we believe it is important to compare the reductions to sort of suitable global targets. Very often we see in the literature or even in political agendas that we refer to reductions by saying oh, we're going to reduce the emissions by 30%, 40%, etc. But it's difficult sometimes to know where, to understand where those values come from. So what we're trying to do here is try to quantify a physics-based model to quantify the budgets. And so the budget module uses a couple of inputs. And the most important input is the global and regional emission pathways. So the idea of the global regional emission pathways are emission pathways for different greenhouse gases that are consistent with modeled global temperature change targets. They're results from integrated assessment models that assess and model the current economic systems and energy system for global regions and global countries and for some big countries, and simulate the different emissions and include a climate model to try to see the radiative forcing effects in the global temperature change targets. They are often based on what we call the shared socioeconomic pathways, which are narratives that describe some key elements of our society, such as resources availability, technology development, drivers of demand, GDP, population, etc., and that translates those narratives into quantitative elements that can be used into the integrated assessment models. And then the integrated assessment models use radiative forcing targets to try to create those global regional emission pathways. So in our work, we've obviously didn't develop the integrated assessment models. We used results from multiple integrated assessment models for multiple scenarios, multiple shared economic pathways. We extracted the regional emission pathways. We used an urban downscaling approach that is extracted from the contraction and convergence method that is found and very commonly used in literature. And the idea of the contraction and convergence approach is to build strategies that consist in reducing overall emissions of greenhouse gases to safe level. So this is sort of the contraction aspect, but bringing every country with emission per capita level that are equal for all countries at a given time. So this is the convergence approach. I'm going to just describe here with 4 different regions. Imagine we have 4 regions, A, B, C, D, with a couple of different emission per capita currently from historical values. The idea of the contraction is to say we're going to need to reduce all the emissions up to a safe level, following emission pathways that are developed by integrated assessment models, for example. The first step is to develop convergence points. So all the countries will reach a certain convergence point with equitable emission per capita. So in that case, for example, here, the region A will need to reduce their emission per capita up to the convergence here, but the region D will be able to increase their emission per capita. And so this idea of this approach is to build a global solution that is equitable and takes into account the historical development in some ways of the different regions. And then all the countries will reduce their emissions following a safe pathways to be consistent with the global temperature change target. The next step is to develop a sectoral downscaling, because when we have regions, for each region, there are multiple different types of sectors in economic development. In our work, we assumed a very simple approach by assuming proportional efforts from all sectors, but the idea here is to look at the mitigation efforts for the different sectors and what could be the potential sectoral downscaling. And so at the end, you obtain a budget, a cumulative budget for a specific sector and a specific human environment that is suitable for global targets. Obviously, there are high uncertainties with this budget, but we still believe that it is important to have a first estimate to be able to build technological and policy targets. So the mitigation module is, once we have this budget, the idea is to compare the value of the GHG emissions that we develop with this budget and see what we can do. And the idea of an entire framework is to create some optimizations. So we create baseline scenarios for key variables. Nobody knows what will happen in the near future or even the long-term future. And so in order to build mitigation efforts, we need to know what are the baseline scenarios. Then we identify a couple of mitigation variables that are suitable to the urban center. That follows the evolve, shift, and improve approach to try to understand and to comprehend as much mitigation strategies as possible. And finally, we estimate the values for these mitigation variables to remain within this budget. So there is an iterative approach where we simulate the emissions for a given mitigation variable value and try to see what value will bring the budget. So in our case study, Singapore is an interesting case study because it has already implemented a lot of measures to limit private car usage and ownership. We choose 3 different key variables representing the avoid, shift, improve. The avoid component, we choose the total motorized transport activity, which is basically the passenger kilometer travel by motorized transport. And we actually developed the baseline scenarios assuming that there is no changes to motorized passenger transport per capita, which is quite consistent with what happened in the next few years, in the last few years. And obviously the mitigation variables, the variable that we optimized in our model was an annual degrowth rate to see what should be the degrowth rate to reach a certain target. In the shift components, the key variable is the public transit model share. In Singapore, there are 2 different rapid transit systems and they are buses. We create 2 different scenarios. One that sort of simulate a worst case scenario, assuming that all the policies toward private car usage and ownership are being scrapped. And so we have an increasing share of private cars in the next decades. This is probably not likely, but this is to sort of to represent a worst case scenario. And we created another case scenario, which is more or less a business as usual, which is the public transit development scenario, which assumes historical trends. Singapore has pledged to invest a lot of public transit for the past 5 years and for the next years. So it's probably a likely scenario. And at the end, mitigation variable is what should be the public transit share. And finally, in the improve component, Singapore has pledged to electrify their entire fleet by 2040. So we simulated this in their baseline scenarios. There is a strong interest for electrification in Singapore, even though there's no electric vehicles currently because of many reasons, and especially economic reasons and infrastructure reasons in Singapore. And we simulate 2 different mitigation variables, the electrification target years and the GHG intensity of the electricity. Anyway, so this is some specific details about the method. Now I'm going to dive into some results. So applying the method and the framework to Singapore, we found historically that 66% of the GHG emissions were from private cars, even though they only accounted for 33%. So in these 2 graphs on the right, you can see the annual emissions, the life cycle emissions from urban passenger and land transport in Singapore. And you can see that the green on the bottom of the chart represent the private car proportion. And on the left, you see the passenger kilometer traveled by motorized transport in Singapore from 25 to 2020. And so this is quite a common result. Private cars have high emissions per PKT. And so 33% passenger activity, which is quite low compared to a lot of different cities, still results in 66% of emissions. We've now simulated the prospective emissions, and I'm going to show you the ultimate results at the end, the cumulative emissions from 2018 to 2050. So if you remind, we developed 4 basically baseline scenarios. 2 baseline scenarios for the modal share, so a public transit, a private car, a PC, and a public transit, and 2 scenarios for the technology, assuming that there's constant technology, so constant technology market share, and assuming there is an electrification by 2040, which gives us 4 different scenarios. Interestingly, we can see that if there's no change to technology and there is a dominance of private cars, the budget for Singapore could reach up to 200 megaton of CO2 equivalent between 2018 to 2050. This is more than twice the amount of the budget we have estimated. So here in this graph, you can see the budget. We have estimated that for Singapore, a budget of 60 megaton of CO2 equivalent between 2018 and 2050 will be consistent with 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. And a budget of 2 degrees is about 80 megaton of CO2 equivalent. You can see that electrification drastically shift the emission sources. So we have way more electricity production, way more vehicle production, but less fuel use. And we can see that in the baseline, which is actually sort of the ambitious current target of Singapore, deploying public transit and electrifying by 2040, we can see that the reductions are significantly high compared to the worst case scenario, but still, it's still higher than the budget of 2 degrees. So the conclusion is the current policies yield a mitigation gap of at least 27% more reductions. So the question we asked in the model was, what further actions should be taken in terms of mitigation variables to fill this mitigation gap? And so in the next 3 slides, I'm going to present the results if we focus on the avoid, shift, or improve components independently. Take a very simple perspective. So if we focus on the avoid component, and the avoid, if you remember, is the motorized travel activity. The question we're asking is, what should be the degrowth rate of motorized passenger travel activity for the different model share and technology scenarios to reach this budget, to stay within this budget? Unfortunately, I mean, we found that we need deep reductions. So in this table, you can see the baseline scenarios, the different model shares, the different technology scenarios. So we have 4 different scenarios, and you can see the climate change targets. So it means that the actual degrowth rate we need to get in the motorized passenger activity to reach the targets. We can see that, for example, in the worst case scenario for 1.5 budget, we need 9.3 annual degrowth rate, which is obviously, it means around a 10% reduction per year in motorized passenger land travel activity, which is obviously a huge value. If you look at the minimum value we find for the 2-degree budget, in case of public transit development and electrification, we find a 2.5% of annual growth rate, which is very, very high, still very optimistic. For example, the historical trends between 2015 and 2019 is a minus 1.2. So it means that the actual motorized travel activity has increased in the last 5 years. This is mostly because of the deployment of rapid transit systems, but private cars have not that much decreased. And we've quantified that an optimistic value, if Singapore tries to reach what are the base cases of cities in the world by 2050, it will be a value between 2 and 3%. So overall, it is maybe possible for Singapore with the current policies to reach this target if they focus on reducing the total motorized passenger land travel activity. Some high-level solutions, which obviously are very difficult to quantify, are changes in urban settlement patterns, and more importantly, promotion of active mobility. For those of you who have been in Singapore, active mobility is very difficult because when it's very warm outside, you don't want to bike or walk. But still, those solutions should be embedded into future policies. Now, if we look at the shift component, so the public transit share, we've said before that the current trends and the current objective of Singapore are not enough. And so the question we ask is, if we don't change the motorized transport activity under the different technology scenarios, so if we have a constant fleet or if we have an electrified fleet by 2040, what should be the annual changes in public transit share? So from 2010 to 2015, there's been an increase by 1.5% annually of public transit. So it means that every year we had plus 1.5% on average of model share, of additional model share from public transit. We find that to reach a 2-degree budget, we need to reach around 3% in the next years, which is twice the amount of what has been done in the last year. So it means that even though Singapore has pledged on large investments, they should probably aim for more investments and for more public transit. And so another key component here is also to reduce the convenience in private car use. Singapore is a very interesting country with high fees for vehicle ownership, with taxes for private car usage. And so they should not scrap those policies. And I mean, it's not in the agenda. They even say that they want to do even stronger policies for that, but they should really keep those because reducing convenience in private car use is a key component to shift toward lower emitting modes. And finally, we focused on the electrification. And we asked the question of, okay, let's assume we don't change the motorized travel activity. We don't change much the baseline scenarios for public transit. So the public transit goes as it is planned. Can we do something on the electric vehicles, because it's the main interest right now in Singapore, to reach these targets, to stay within the budgets? Interestingly, and you probably know why, we focus on 2 variables here. The electrification target here, so when should we aim for complete electrification, and the electricity GHG intensity. In this graph, I'm showing for two different panels that represent two different model shares. So a PC is the worst case private car, and the PT is the public transit. I'm representing on the y-axis the electricity GHG intensity. In Singapore, currently is around 0.4 kilogram of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. Singapore is dominated by natural gas. Singapore has very low resources for renewable sources. And on the x-axis, I'm representing complete electrification. And for each case, we can see cumulative emissions between 2018 to 2050, and we can see the budgets. So the white values represent a case that is consistent with the 2-degree target, and a dark blue representing a value that is consistent with the 1.5-degree target. As you can imagine here, if we keep within electrification in 2040, which is the green line, then the electricity GHG intensity on average between now and 2050 needs to be divided by 2, which is a huge change in the electricity market of Singapore. It basically means that between now and 2050, half of the electricity should come from renewable sources and the other half from natural gas sources. As I said, the big challenge in Singapore is they don't have much renewable sources, so they need to rely on importing energy from neighbors, Malaysia, for example, or Indonesia. And it's quite difficult to imagine such scenarios, but still some researchers are trying to implement renewable scenarios by then. I think the key message here is to, even though we focus on urban passenger transport, obviously this is one of the cases where multi-sectoral policies are important, especially that electric vehicles will influence the power system. And so here we quantify electricity GHG intensity as is, it's a value that is not being affected by the electrification. But if we have a complete electrification by 2040, we've calculated in the work, there is a rapid and a drastic change in electricity consumption in Singapore because of electricity, which means that it's even harder for them to reach a lower electricity GHG intensity. So this coordination needs to be included when you do policies, and it needs to be thought when you quantify. So overall, we focus on independent elements. We can also build sort of comprehensive figures where we look at all the components together. And so in this complicated graph, we can see different panels. So the columns represent the annual growth rates. So 0% means no changes to the motorized travel activity. 2% means annual degrowth rate of 2%. The columns, the rows, represent different electricity GHG intensity scenarios. The first one is an electricity intensity electricity that is derived from natural gas from now up to 2050. And the transition to renewable, the second row, it's a scenario that has been developed by researchers in Singapore, assuming a complete renewable energy by 2040. For each panel, the y-axis represents the changes in public transit, and the x-axis represents the complete electrification. So this value here between 0%, 2%, and are taken from what we think and imagine are optimistic cases, but still they represent cases where we can quantify what should be the set of solutions. And we can see here that reaching a 2%, for example, a 2-degree target, staying within a budget of 2-degree target requires stringent and strong commitments and quick actions for sort of all the components of the work. So the overall conclusion is that it's not easy, obviously, to reach and to stay within these budgets, and that should take actions quite quickly. So now I'm going to sort of conclude and take a high perspective. So I presented a framework that we developed in Singapore and with the University of Toronto. And the idea of this framework is by including technical modelings of the different transport modes, of the different vehicle technologies, including the dynamics of some of their interactions, how can we assess the current and prospective emissions and measures at a urban level? And I think the key contribution is to try to compare those measures with global perspective targets. Instead of just saying, oh, we can reduce the emission by 20% and not having a conclusion of, but is it good or is it enough or not? We've tried to quantify suitable budgets in order to say, yes, it is suitable, and not it is not suitable, and what further action should be taken. And so even though I kept a high level perspective on this work, the idea was to say, we want to find solutions that could provide the answer. This framework, we believe, can be applied to any urban centers. We've created an overall general framework, and I presented results for Singapore. And I acknowledge that there are large limitations and uncertainties, and I will be happy to dive into some of them, especially the emission budgets, for example. It's highly uncertain to quantify an emission budget. We believe it's useful, but understanding the potential uncertainties of these budgets on the overall results could be especially important. Initially, we wanted to look at also the co-benefits of doing such work. As you can imagine, this work was, even the current work was tremendous and huge. So we decided to take the co-benefits for a later work. But the idea here is to say the different mitigation pathways have different co-benefits for air pollutants, for example. And when, for example, if you listen to Jacob's presentation earlier today, you can see that there are trade-offs between GHG emissions and air pollutants. And so we wanted to quantify that too. For now, it's not being implemented, but we'll be happy to look at that. And so applying this work in Singapore, that will be my last conclusion, we found the very common climate change conundrum that you have in the literature and everywhere, in every single scientist that is trying to quantify objectives of mitigation with current targets, that there's no easy path and there's no time to hesitate. And so it's complicated, obviously, but we believe that developing a framework such as the one we've developed can at least help us quantify some of those paths and motivate us to not hesitate. Thank you very much, and I stay open if you have any questions.
All right, thank you, Alex. So I'm glad I suggested to all of our speakers to go a little bit shorter, because all three of you used most of your time, but all three very interesting presentations. So thank you for that. Questions, comments, thoughts from the crowd?
I typed in a question.
Oh, thank you, Sandy. Sorry, I didn't see it. Yep. And let me just make sure I've got the right one. So, there's a question about how has COVID-19 and future pandemics affected your model?
Yeah. I think we could keep this question for every single research conference for the next 6 months, because all the researchers that are presenting right now haven't thought about that, obviously. So I will answer that it doesn't change the framework. It doesn't change the idea of how we're trying to achieve and the contributions of the methodological advancements we've done, but it definitely changes the case study. And when you're developing, when you're applying a model and gathering, collecting data and trying to do some simulations, there is already a lag in the data you've collected. For example, here for Singapore, we've collected data for some elements up to 2018, and we've estimated elements for 2019, but we don't even have the data for 2019. So obviously we don't have any data for 2020. So how does that change? I will say not much, to be honest, because the reductions in GHG emissions from the pandemic will probably not last for long. It will definitely curtail it will stop the increase on the short term. But overall, I think the agenda here, the political agenda, is to get an economic development as stronger than before. So the agenda will be to have, to not care about the emissions. Even though we can stay optimistic and we say, oh, after COVID will be different and the world will be beautiful and everything. I don't actually believe that will happen that easily. And I actually believe that this pandemic is just, a short break, a tiny break that will save us. In terms of timing, it maybe save us in the overall 1 month of actions, and not more than that. So I still believe that we need to refine and revolution the entire transport system to be consistent with global targets, and that the pandemic doesn't change much about that.
Thanks, Alex. Other questions? Well, I'll ask one while people are still thinking about theirs. Alex, I know you're not afraid of difficult questions, so I'm gonna go right for it. there's obviously interactions between the reductions needed in the transportation sector and the reductions needed in other sectors. And in particular, some of your scenarios, right? Like the year, or the carbon intensity of the electric grid. As that varies, that means other emissions are also varying. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you know, you're really focused on this sector, this transportation specific target. Can you speak about the bigger picture?
Yeah, yes. I mean, on the long term, I mean, this is a key question because on the modeling side, you know, what I think my types of research is trying to quantify what is hard to quantify to provide sort of guidance. So what has been done for now are global models. So if you, I don't know if some of the people in the audience are familiar with integrated assessment models, but they quantify at sometimes country level, but also global levels. And they take into account a lot of factors. They're brilliant, but it's difficult sometimes to extract a political implication from them. And also to get a sense at a practical sense at a lower level. So obviously here we're taking the other side. We're looking at a very refined sector at a very refined location. One way that one solution we've taken in our work to sort of limit the interactions between the different sectors and the shifts is the life cycle approach. If you embed a life cycle approach in your thinking, then you limit the potential shift in emission sources. As I said here, I included the emissions associated with electricity production, with the fuel production, with battery manufacturing, vehicle manufacturing, etc. So we quantify a budget that is actually for the urban passenger transport, but that includes the life cycle emissions of the urban passenger transport. So it means that this budget is actually more on the consumption side of things and includes other sectors. And if you apply this method to other sectors, then there is a way to not overlap those different budgets and to create budgets per sector that are consistent and overall. I believe the solution of taking the end user perspective of looking at the actual energy use, that could be for buildings, transport, and other types of sectors, is in my sense more relevant for modeling than dividing the sector into transport, manufacturing, electricity, etc. But that's just an approach we've taken. And definitely in further work, I would love to sort of take maybe the urban system and develop and look at all the sectors inside the urban systems and how they interact and apply the current framework to all the sectors within the urban systems. That's definitely a huge work, but that's sort of a hybrid between what I've done, which is focused on one single sector, but still including all the sectors through life cycle emissions, and the high level integrated assessment model perspective that are just looking at broad sectors, broad inputs and outputs, and that can provide high and important emission pathways. So yeah, I hope that answered this question. It's definitely one of the complexity of the work, and all models are wrong, but I think we're trying to get a useful model here. So